Hey ghouls and gals, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor and today's video is going to be the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader book tag. Welcome back. If you're a returning subscriber, if you're a new subscriber, welcome. My name is Taylor and I read primarily fantasy and horror. So when I saw this fantasy tag going around Booktube, I knew I really wanted to participate in it since fantasy is a large part of what I read here. So this is a little bit of a longer tag. We've got 10 questions, so I'm going to go ahead and get into it. I will leave the questions down below in the description bar so you can participate as well. If you'd like to participate in this tag, or if you already have filmed a video, leave it down below in the comments and I would love to watch yours. But without further ado, let's just get into the tag. The first question is, what is your fantasy origin story? How did you get into reading fantasy? And like a lot of other late 90s, early 2000s kids, we were the Harry Potter generation. I don't want to talk too much about that for a lot of reasons, but honestly, Harry Potter was what got me into reading. It was one of the very first books that I really wanted to learn how to read so I could pick it up on my own. But then building off of that, the Lord of the Rings movies were coming out when I was in grade school and I absolutely loved them. And when I realized that those were books, I tried to read those books, didn't really like them as much as I did the movies, but I did find a lot of other books that were similar to it. I fell deep into the Redwall books at this point in time. They're pretty much honestly like Lord of the Rings light. They are for middle grade and it's about a bunch of anthropomorphic woodland animals and it's like medieval fantasy, good versus evil, fighting out some battles. And I would honestly highly recommend that series to any younger reader wanting to get into medieval fantasy, especially if they like the Lord of the Rings movies, because I do like the books now, but just like first, second grade wasn't so much into sitting through all of Tolkien's endless descriptions, stuff like that. So I really enjoyed the Redwall books. I read through those so fast and those were coming out like a book a year. So I honestly remember just waiting for the next one to come out. I go to my library and just check out my favorite ones of that series all the time. So I've read that series like countless times. So that was my big introduction. Eragon also came out when I was in third grade and I actually have my copy and I'm gonna show you. I have my little book plate in Eragon with my third grade handwriting. And when I picked that series up and I started to read it, I really felt like I was reading big kid books, adult books, which, you know, Eragon is YA. But for a third grader, I really felt really proud of myself for finishing that series and just got really invested. And then in I think 7th or 6th grade, I actually fell in love with the His Dark Materials trilogy. And so that was what really cemented my love for the genre and also for different types of subgenres within fantasy as well. And His Dark Materials, The Golden Compass especially, is one of my favorite books of all time. Question number 2, if you could be the heroine in a fantasy novel, who would you choose to write it and what trope would have to be in there? Now this question was harder than I thought it would be because my first instinct was to say R.F. Kuang because The Poppy War is one of my favorite series of all time now, but I'm really thinking about it and that's a pretty dark fantasy to be in the world of. And as much as I love the writing and love all of the dark conflict, I don't know if I would want to be in that scenario. So I think actually for this one, I'm gonna go with Samantha Shannon, just because her books tend to end a little more optimistically. I'd really love that happy ending for myself. So I think I would have to go with her. And then for the trope, like I mentioned before, I mean, this is probably some like copyright infringement, but I loved the concept of demons in His Dark Materials. And if you haven't read that series, everyone in that world has half of their soul outside of their body and it is an animal companion. The animal can change shapes until you hit like puberty, until you hit the person that you're going to become, and then it stays settled into one shape and that animal represents who you are. And I would love to have that. That was a big draw for me as a child reading this series, and I still would love to have a demon, but you know, I don't know how deep we're going into this in terms of copyright infringement and using other people's ideas, but just any sort of like smart animal companions. I'm I'm a big animal lover and I just think it would be really cool. I've noticed a lot of my favorite fantasies do tend to have those animal companions or like magical creature companions, like dragon riders, stuff like that, you know, series or worlds where the animals can actually communicate with you. So that would just be really cool. Just any sort of animal or magical companion. That would be my type of trope. That would definitely have to be in there. And then question number 3 is, what is one fantasy book that you've read this year that you really want more people to read? And for that one, I am going to go with the Monstrous graphic novel series. This is volume 1. I mean, it's blurbed by Neil Gaiman, first of all, so you should know that that's some heavy-hitting fantasy action awesomeness going on in here. But this is like high fantasy, steampunk, horror almost. It's got a lot going on. Some badass female protagonists. There are fights between humans and these half-humans, half-demon sort of creatures, demons depending on which side of this war you're on, and different otherworldly beings as well. It's super cool. The art style is absolutely wonderful. I could honestly take any single one of these pages and frame it. The art style is beautiful. The characters are wonderful. The 5th volume comes out this year, so it is one that is continuously coming out, but you do have quite a few volumes to binge if you are so inclined, and I absolutely love it. This has so many wonderful fantasy tropes that get turned on their heads, so especially if you love anything including like found families or quests to find out who you are and who your heritage is, I would highly recommend this graphic novel series. Micah Half-Wolf is one of my favorite female fantasy protagonists. And then question 4 is a two-parter, so that's, what's your favorite fantasy subgenre and what genre do you want to read more of? And this is really hard because I think my answer is gonna have to be the same for both of the questions. So my favorite fantasy subgenre is fantasy horror or horror fantasy. I absolutely love that. However, I have not read a lot of it. It's something that pretty much any sort of thing that I've read, I've loved, but I haven't read a lot of it. So I definitely want to read more of it, and it's also probably like my favorite fantasy subgenre. If I'm thinking about my favorite fantasy books, they all actually kind of go into different subgenres, but expanding that list to think of my preferences and tastes in general, it's definitely got to be horror fantasy. I mean, those are the two genres that I read the most of, so when you combine them together, something incredible happens. Question number 5 is, who are your auto-buy fantasy authors? And this is hard because I have different tiers. So for example, R.F. Kuang, I'm gonna buy anything that she writes. I honestly already have because The Puppy War was her debut, and I've heard that she's working on a dark fantasy. Actually, I don't even know if it's dark fantasy, it just might be dark academia. So she's working on that next, which I'm also intrigued in, so definitely her. And then Joe Hill as well. I will purchase anything that he writes or collabs with. Lock and Key is one of my favorite horror fantasy series, and then a lot of his short story collections also are really good blends of horror and fantasy. Now, I do have a couple other ones that I would say they're auto-buy, but it's kind of tricky because definitely not everything. So Sarah J Maas, her books are always a fun time. I don't have any interest in reading the Court of whatever and whatever series, but I am really enjoying Throne of Glass at the moment, and I am going to continue on with Crescent City. So hers, it's just kind of going to be if I am interested in the premise. So not technically an auto-buy author, but most of her things I have been interested in. Likewise for Samantha Shannon, Priory of the Orange Tree is one of my favorite books of all time. I want to read The Bone Season. I'm interested in reading The Bone Season, but I haven't read it yet, so I can't really call her an auto-buy because I haven't really read too much from her, but I'm interested in seeing what she does next. And then also Philip Pullman, pretty much his dark materials are wonderful. The series that he's writing right now, which is an extension of that world, is good, but not as great as the original trilogy. And then he does have some other works that I'm just not interested in. So pretty much anything from his dark materials world I'm interested in, but not really his other projects that he's done in the past. Question number 6 is, how do you typically find your fantasy recommendations? And for me, primarily Goodreads. I'll just go on like the new releases pages and look for books there. And then I'll also go on publishers' websites and look to see if they have any like articles compiling lists. For example, Tor.com does an amazing job of pretty much not weekly articles, but very consistent articles talking about like 10 horror books coming out this year or 10 novellas coming out this year. So just different suggestions for their publishing press. And obviously they're just going to be talking about their specific books, so you'll have to go to different publishers to find out different publishers, like what's being printed. That is really reliable as well. Obviously Booktube and Bookstagram are great as well. I have noticed honestly that books that get hyped up on Bookstagram are different than books that get hyped up on Booktube and vice versa. So if you kind of have like a foot in each door, you can kind of see a lot of different recommendations that you may have missed had you only really been watching or viewing one. And then honestly, straight from the horse's mouth, as it were, or just author promos on social media. For example, the other day, R.F. Kuang tweeted out a book that she really loved, so that went on my list automatically. Definitely a great thing about living in the age of social media is that authors in real time are talking about which books that they really enjoyed, not just books that they've blurbed. So that's a really good way to get good recommendations as well, because odds are your favorite authors, you're probably going to have the same reading tastes as them if you like the books that they're creating. And kind of going along with this question is question number 7, an upcoming release that you're really excited about. And I actually have a whole video that I will leave linked down below for my most anticipated upcoming releases, and I believe it was from July through December. So definitely go check that out because there are a lot of fantasy releases in there. At the moment, I'd probably say The Bone Shard's Daughter by Andrea Stewart, I want to say, is coming out in September, and it is for fans of R.F. Kuang is what I've heard. So again, that's like an automatic, I'm going to check that out. It has to do with bone shard magic, and it's the start of an epic fantasy series, so I'm really looking forward to that one. Question number 8, what is one misconception about fantasy that you'd like to correct? You know, I feel like a lot of misconceptions have been corrected. Again, like I said, in the age of information, which is where we are, it's really easy to kind of correct misconceptions. But maybe one that I would say is that not everything is like Lord of the Rings. Obviously, if you love Tolkien, you love Lord of the Rings, you're going to find so many books that are heavily inspired by that world and that sort of feel of book, and you can just definitely read that and only read that and be perfectly fine. But fantasy is so much more broad and so much more nuanced than that you can definitely find a niche. One of my favorite subcategories is horror fantasy. That's obviously going to read a whole lot differently from The Hobbit, so you know, different readers, even ones that haven't read fantasy before, can find different niches. There's also like fantasy sci-fi blends that would be good for people who like more sci-fi. I mean, you can, it's a big umbrella and you can find a book that you'll like within it. And I'd also probably say as a caveat to that, it doesn't all have to be epic fantasy. There are a ton of fantasy novellas and shorter form works and standalone fantasies that you can read and enjoy, because I know a lot of people who don't like series tend to kind of have the preference of enjoying contemporary, because it is pretty common to have a large series in fantasy. But if you're not a series reader, you can definitely find short stories or standalone novels to fit your preferences as well. Question number 9, if someone had never read fantasy before and wanted a book recommendation, what are 3 books that you'd recommend to them? All right, so I'd say number 1, I would recommend The Golden Compass or Northern Lights by Philip Pullman, just because this is my favorite book. So I mean, I'm very biased and I can give a glowing review of it any day, and I feel like that definitely helps when recommending books for people to read. But this one is set in a world adjacent to our own, and there are a lot of similarities between the worlds, and you actually go back and forth as the series progresses between different worlds, including our own. So I think going into a fantasy world, there are a lot of things in this world that are reminiscent of our world. So that's definitely going to be easier if you've never read fantasy to read from a world that's a lot like ours, because I feel like it can be very intimidating if you've never read fantasy to pick up a book and see, you know, there's a different world, there's 5 different maps, all the characters are named things that you don't see in real life. All that can be confusing. So Golden Compass definitely feels like a very accessible book in those ways, where it does feel a lot like our world, just with some fun magical elements. Probably going to also say Eragon by Christopher Paolini. Now, I know a lot of criticism of this book was that it was essentially Lord of the Rings and Star Wars mashed together, especially in this first book, which, you know, it's definitely influenced by those, but I think that might be a good thing for someone trying to get into fantasy, because I feel like it's safe to say that most people, even if they don't read fantasy books, have either heard of or seen Lord of the Rings or Star Wars. So this does follow a lot of similar types of plots. So I think that familiarity could actually work in favor of someone who's never read fantasy before. By already having those concepts in your head, there's a lot of Tolkien influences in here. So if you've just seen The Lord of the Rings, you can kind of pick up like the dwarves and the elves, kind of what they look like and what they're about just based on the movies. And then also like the different archetypes and some of the plots in here are very reminiscent of Star Wars: A New Hope, so you kind of have that familiarity to pull on. And then it's in between two here, so hear me out, because this one might not seem like something for fantasy beginners at first, but I'm gonna have to go with Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, which I get. She's chunky and she's intimidating, but this book is split into 3 different acts, so if you just pretend like those are 3 different books, I think it gets a lot less intimidating. The writing style is very easily accessible. It is an adult book, but I think this is a good bridging gap for people who primarily read YA wanting to get into adult. And I think the world building is done in such a way, and it is such a big book, that the world building is so spaced out and organic that you're not getting all of these concepts at once. You're getting fed them a little bit at a time so you don't get overwhelmed. Everyone really loves dragons, so that is a benefit in here. There's also a love story featured throughout this, so someone who does love romance, for example, would really love that plot point in here, while also enjoying the other non-romance focused aspects of this book. And okay, this is also just a little selfish of a pick for me, because so many people who I know would absolutely love this book are just intimidated by the size. So don't let that fail you. This is amazing. I love it. And honestly, if you can get past the page count, it is an easily readable book. It does not feel like an 800-page book, because you're gonna be flying through it. So probably recommend that. But if this seems a little nuts to you, I'll also say that Monstrous would also be good, because graphic novels are short. You have the visual benefits, so the different creatures and the different species of the different characters are easier to visualize when you can actually see drawings of them. And there are also, in between each different issue in this volume bind-up, there are little pages explaining world building, so that also lays it out pretty clear for you as well. And then the 10th and final question is, what is the most recent fantasy content creator you'd like to shout out? And that's actually going to be the person that I got this tag from, and that's Books with Brittany. I absolutely love her channel. She is such a positive light. Her vlogs are very entertaining yet concise. She's really good about talking about books, which I know should be a given on Booktube, but I love her review videos as well. She does spoiler reviews, non-spoiler reviews. She's really good at articulating what exactly about a book that worked for her and what exactly didn't work for her. And what I also really like is, just because she doesn't like a book, she's not going to not recommend it to other people, which I think is really helpful in finding new fantasy books. And she just seems like such a genuine, fun person. So I'll definitely leave her channel below so you can check her out, because I definitely get a lot of fantasy book recommendations from her. But that is going to be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a comment down below, give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more content from me. Stay safe, stay well, and I'm so glad you're here, and I will catch y'all in my next video. Bye!